9 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I would start this week. The first guy, Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Herbert, the last two games, it's been mediocre to poor ball games, especially after the big tear he was on the first 5 weeks of the season. His biggest game of the year was Week 5 versus Cleveland, 398 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, a rushing touchdown, 29 rushing yards, and a 2-point conversion for Herbert. But right now, the last 2 weeks here, it's been a disappointment. Week 6 at Baltimore for Herbert, 195 passing yards, a touchdown in it though, and 12 rushing yards. And then Week 8 versus the New England Patriots, 223 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 windows, and 9 rushing yards, only good for 17 fantasy points. So this week, he's got a better matchup, in my opinion, at the Philadelphia Eagles. I know the Chargers, they got to travel across country, but this team can't afford to lose their third game in a row. And I think Philly really can't stop anyone from what we've seen so far this season. So I think Herbert gets back on track. You could start him with confidence. And I expect 25 to 30 fantasy points in this one for Herbert. The next quarterback's Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Joe Burrow, he's having an amazing fantasy season with 20 or more fantasy points now ever since Week 3 here. And the last couple weeks here for Burrow. Week 7 at Baltimore, 416 passing yards, 3 touchdowns in it though. And then Week 8 versus the New York Jets, 259 passing yards, 3 touchdowns and an interception. So each and every week, it looks like the second half of ball games, Joe Burrow gets going and gets the big points. And this week, he's got a great matchup on paper versus the Cleveland Browns that give up the fifth most fantasy points to quarterback. So in this one, I think Burrow will crack 20 points once again this week. And it wouldn't surprise me to see him have 30 to 32 point range here if he really heats up and gets things going. It's a great matchup. They got the bye week after this, and after a bad loss to the Jets, Burrow and this offense have to get off to a quicker start in this one. The next quarterback's Derek Carr of the Las Vegas Raiders. So the Raiders coming off a bye week in Week 8 here. They travel cross country as well at the New York Giants. But Derek Carr, ever since Jon Gruden got fired in Week 5, he's had a couple decent games now versus tough defenses. Week 6 at Denver, 341 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Week 7 versus Philadelphia, 323 passing yards, 2 touchdowns in Into, and 1 rushing yard. So right here this week at the Giants, it's a big ball game for Derek Carr. And this Giant defense, in my opinion, they're vulnerable to the big plays in the passes, even though they did a pretty decent job on Monday Night Football versus the Kansas City Chiefs in Week 8. But right here in Week 9, I think Derek Carr and this team, they're going to come out on fire. They rested now in Week 8 with the bye week. And right here, they could take advantage of, in my opinion, of the New York Giants. And I like Carr as a start this week. The next quarterback, Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. So Tua, since he returned from injury, he's been pretty decent, in my opinion. Week 6 in his return at Jacksonville, 329 passing yards, 2 touchdowns and an Into, and 22 rushing yards. Week 7 versus Atlanta, 291 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 Into, and 29 rushing yards. And last week in a very tough matchup at the Buffalo Bills that give up the least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks, he still had a mediocre ball game with 15 fantasy points, 205 passing yards, an interception, 10 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and a 2-point conversion. But this week, too, he's got an amazing matchup versus the Houston Texans that give up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And right here, the Texans, they're one of the worst teams in the league. I know the Dolphins aren't any better either here, but I think to win this ball game could take advantage of that defense and have a good fantasy day. And a guy you could start with confidence. And the fifth and final quarterback I would start this week, Mac Jones of the New England Patriots. So Mac Jones, he had a little bit of a letdown ball game at the Chargers in Week 8. But hey, the Patriots went out there and still won the game, 218 passing yards, 10 rushing yards, and a 2-point conversion. But this week here, Week 9, at the Carolina Panthers, this Panther team, they're banged up and they're not doing much, in my opinion. So I think Mac Jones, he could have a pretty decent game on the road here for this New England Patriot team. And I think he could get anywhere from 20 to 25 point range. Him and his receivers, they're building a rapport as the weeks go on. And he really likes targeting the tight ends, obviously, and Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith. So right here, it's a good matchup. I know the Panthers are pretty decent versus the pass, but in my opinion, I think Mac Jones could get some things going versus this team and is a decent start, especially in 2 quarterback leagues or deeper leagues with bye weeks and injuries. So that's a few quarterbacks I would start in week 9 of the fantasy football season.